Hello, this is a presentation of the ICER 2020 through 2023 Value Assessment Framework given by me, Dr. Steve Pearson, on January 31st, 2020. So the goals of this webinar are to present you very briefly with a background on ICER, to cover ICER's guiding principles for health technology assessment, to run through the conceptual elements of ICER's Value Assessment Framework, and to talk as well about our procedures for generating our reports, engaging with stakeholders, and convening our public meetings. More detailed descriptions on all of these elements can be found in the document, the ICER Value Assessment Framework, posted on our website, and other methods, documents, and engagement guides that are there as well. So first, a brief word about ICER. The Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, or ICER, is an independent health technology assessment group founded in 2006 at Harvard Medical School. Today, a nonprofit independent group, we develop publicly available value assessment reports on medical tests, different kinds of treatments, and delivery system innovations. Importantly, we have also always convened regional independent appraisal committees, people who do not work for us but represent clinicians, methodologists, patient and public representatives. We convene them for public hearings to deliberate upon each report. The funding sources for ICER are kept updated on our website and shown here for 2019. In general, the vast majority of our resources come from nonprofit foundation grants. The chief funder within that set of organizations is the Laura and John Arnold Foundation. But over the past few years, we've also received and continue to receive funding from other foundations, including the Commonwealth Foundation, the California Healthcare Foundation, the National Institute for Healthcare Management, and others. We do have approximately 20%, 21%, as you see here, of funding that comes from health plans and provider groups and from manufacturers. Those funds come in the form of membership dues that support a separate policy summit program and other activities with those organizations, the goal of which is to convene their leaders to discuss evidence policy and to work towards consensus on ways to improve the healthcare system. We have a small amount still from government grants and contracts, but as you can see, the leading source of our funding, and that which is solely responsible for our research and public meetings, come from nonprofit foundations. So what are the guiding goals and principles of our work? It really is centered around the idea of fair prices, fair access, future innovation, and fair deliberation. So each of these requires obviously some interpretation, but the idea is that they all depend upon each other, that they all should fit together. First, a fair price, we think, means aligning the price with the added benefit for patients. We think that that is the best way to assure healthcare resources are available to achieve the maximum health without doing more harm than good, because even if new interventions are effective, they can be priced in a way that will overall lead to more detriment in healthcare by impacts on patients and their families losing insurance, delaying care, and other factors. So a fair price is aligning that price with the benefit to patients. Now, importantly, when we have fair pricing in particular, but in general, even when we don't, we should have a healthcare system that provides fair access. We think it'll be easier with fair pricing, but what does fair access mean? It means applying evidence and considerations of value to coverage in a way that does not primarily shift costs onto patients and their families, or that uses burdens of coverage authorization or other tools to try to limit appropriate access. So fair price and fair access are important cornerstones of the goals and principles that we hope to achieve with our work. Another piece is future innovation. We strongly believe that both patients and the general public want a thriving ecosystem for innovation in the U.S. healthcare system, one that brings demonstrable benefits to patients, but of course we believe that that needs to be done at prices that patients in the system can afford. So that important piece of the picture of what we're trying to achieve really does include future innovation. And for us, partly because we do convene and help moderate the meetings in public, we think fair deliberation is a really critical piece of all of these goals. Through fair deliberation, we mean showing respect for all participants, patients certainly first and foremost, but their carers and family members and other stakeholders, including life science companies, payers, clinical experts, and others. Fair deliberation can show respect for everyone by having very clear, transparent, and inclusive procedures. So, for instance, when we look for evidence, we include evidence from all sources. We are not going to exclude voices at the table. And then ultimately, in our work, both in a sense evaluating the evidence, but certainly as that evidence is translated through to policy recommendations and other ways of kind of conveying information, the thinking behind that process needs to be transparent. And we hope that that goal is taken up by all the decision makers in our system, such as manufacturers and insurers and others. We hope that our work can contribute to a broader sense of fair deliberation across the board. So with that as a brief introduction, the conceptual elements of our value assessment framework are really a part of our trying to show respect and transparency and some of these other guiding principles. And it's also meant to achieve the fair pricing and certainly hopefully fair access and future innovation that we want as well. So the purpose of the value framework, as I said, is to make transparent how we conceive of value and therefore how it is evaluated in our reports. Importantly, it takes a population level perspective. That means that it's not trying to serve as a shared decision-making tool that would be used by a single patient and his or her doctor, and because that's an really important area where evidence should support better decision-making, but that really needs to be tailored to the individual situation in a very specific way. There are other kinds of decisions, though, that are made at the population level, such as what is the price that will be charged for this drug, or what is the coverage policy. And so our work really is intended to serve the thinking that affects those kinds of population level policies. However, importantly, even with that level focus at the population, we do want our value framework to incorporate and reflect the experiences and values of patients. There has to be a connection there, or we really lose something important. So what does that value framework look like? Well, again, we feel it's important to start with the goal: fair price, fair access, and future innovation. Now, when thinking about what types of evidence decision makers need to see to try to work together to achieve those goals, we think there are two main components. One is having a really firm grasp of what the long-term value for money is of different interventions in the healthcare system. And another is, while thinking long-term, what do we need to also be aware of about the short-term affordability? Now, long-term value for money itself is a very complicated, if you will, conceptual idea. But we think it is comprised really of four main components or domains. One is the comparative clinical effectiveness. What can we tell about how treatments or tests or delivery system interventions, what is their impact relatively on clinical effectiveness? Another is incremental cost-effectiveness. That's really a long-term view on comparing the costs and outcomes of different care options to each other. We'll talk a lot about other benefits or disadvantages and contextual considerations as important domains of thinking when you're coming up with an overall judgment of long-term value for money. And for short-term affordability, really the piece of information that decision makers need to think about is the potential budget impact and how that can be managed in different ways. So I'm going to come back to each piece of this picture of the value assessment framework, but I want to talk about some of the key elements or the key takeaways from it first. First, again, is this idea that we anchor our view of value in the long term. Yes, I will talk more about the short-term budget issues and affordability, but this really is an attempt to to reflect what we all want, which is we want to reward and recognize long-term value for patients and others in the system. It's important also to note that this value framework is really deeply rooted in the evidence on comparative clinical effectiveness, which is part of cost effectiveness, but it really is an important beginning part of where we start when we talk about value. I'm going to tell you more about how we accept multiple forms of evidence. Our value framework does not say that we only accept one type of study or studies from one source, and I'll talk a lot more about that. Really importantly, the picture itself and what I will cover later show that we recognize that what matters to patients most is really not limited in any way to what's measured as clinical outcomes in studies. That's an important piece of the puzzle, but it's a very important piece of the puzzle, but it's not all that matters to patients, and sometimes it's far from the most important thing that matters to patients. Linked to that, we certainly acknowledge the role of contextual considerations, which I'll speak of again later, in value judgments. Evidence does not exist in a vacuum. No decisions exist in a vacuum. So acknowledging that contextual issues should play a factor in decision making and how we get the patient and other perspectives incorporated in that in those decisions is very important to us. And to note, and when we talk of value, overall, we do think that potential budget impact and short-term affordability needs to be part of the discussion because it really does affect the thinking and the actions that are taken in any healthcare system around the world, and we have to be able to look at it cleanly, clearly, and consider it as a part of the decision. So let's start with a deeper dive into comparative clinical effectiveness. What we do as part of that is what we call a systematic review of the evidence. It means that we're not trying to cherry pick just the best or the worst way to think about the evidence about some new intervention, let's say. At the beginning of our process, we really look to patients and patient groups because we need them to help inform us what outcomes are important to them. And we need their help in understanding the differences across kind of what it's like to experience a condition in terms of its severity, what's it like for patients early or late in the course of the disease or illness, and all the other features that patients really have to be the first and most important voice in. A systematic review of evidence working from that foundation then goes out to look first for publicly available material, published studies most likely, but we also think about the possible generation of new data. Maybe we'll generate a new survey or a new kind of cohort study of some kind that can be fit into the time frame of our review and get new information from patients and caregivers to help fill in or complement the gaps. We have a very specific option also for what's called in-confidence material from manufacturers to be made part of our reviews. This is material that manufacturers might not be able to make public yet. It might be part of an early publication. It's under consideration by editors, but we can take it in confidence and make it part of our thinking and in the report while still keeping it confidential, but having an agreement with manufacturers that it would later be made public so that we can contribute to the more full transparency around evidence that's important for decision making. So part of our approach to systematic reviews of the evidence is that we really do look for evidence from multiple sources, types of studies. So we are not just looking at randomized controlled trials. That obviously has been the linchpin of the kinds of studies that the FDA and other regulators around the world have looked to. So there are frequently randomized controlled trials, at least on drugs when they are first brought into clinical practice. But we accept and look for evidence from all sources, different types of studies, etc. With that evidence, we obviously want to try to make direct comparisons between two options that a patient might have, but we often are forced, honestly, to try to do indirect comparisons because we often find that new treatments, for instance, or even old treatments and new treatments really have not been tested directly head-to-head in a clinical trial. And maybe the real-world evidence isn't available yet to do that kind of direct comparison. So we need to do good indirect comparisons, often through a technical approach called network meta-analysis. In all of our work, we look carefully. We seek out and try to understand whether there are subgroups of patients that can be identified that respond particularly well to a treatment or particularly poorly. And we also know that every average is just an average, and that may mean that there's an extremely broad range of response to a treatment. And we want to understand the average because we're going to be talking about population level policies like a price, and there will be one price, and it's going to be based mostly on the average. But that we don't want to obscure the importance of understanding how broad the range of reactions and responses can be. And again, partly always looking for an ability to highlight where drugs or other treatments can be particularly helpful or harmful. And that can help guide patients, clinicians, and certainly insurers. We use a certain rating system to try to be as transparent and consistent as we can about how we take all this information and then put it into a kind of a way of thinking about the strength of the evidence about how much better a treatment is versus another option. We do this through what we call the ICER Evidence-Based Medicine, or EBM, rating matrix. I'm not going to go through this in detail. Again, the details are available on our website and in a published article, but the basic idea here is that the vertical axis is the level of certainty we can have in the evidence. Certainty because there's a lot of it or because it's very high quality, but obviously sometimes the evidence is lacking and has certain concerns, limitations. The horizontal axis is our best judgment based on the evidence we have of what the comparative net health benefit is. And by net health benefit, we mean the risks and the benefits looked at together. Because all treatments, most treatments, have some risks as well as benefits. And if we're comparing two different treatments, we need to try to put that into some kind of comparative framework. So here, based on the level of certainty and our best estimate of the comparative net health benefit, we kind of break it down into whether we have high certainty of a certain net health benefit or moderate certainty or very low certainty. And we use different kind of grades, if you will, to show our thinking. I'll just give you a couple of examples. So if we think we have high certainty that a new treatment has substantial overall net health benefit compared to prior treatments, we would give it an A. But if we thought that the evidence was strong, but it was still, there was enough uncertainty, some studies were inconsistent with other findings, so we still think it's better, but we just don't know if it's just a little bit better or a lot better, we might well give it a B+. And you can see how that range just expresses, in a sense, our degree of confidence and how precise we can be about the net health benefit. I'm not going to go through the rest of the ratings, but as you can see, as you go down and you get to the lower ratings, if you will, they tend to have either a lower estimate of the net health benefit and or more uncertainty. So let's turn now to incremental cost effectiveness. So it is a whole field unto itself, and it can be very complex. I'm going to try to give a high-level overview of its methods and how we apply it in the terms of doing an ICER evidence report. Structurally, what happens is that we use a computer to create simulated models comparing, kind of creating and then comparing the long-term clinical outcomes and costs for different treatment options. So you kind of create a pathway, if you will, showing that if a patient takes a certain drug, they have this likelihood of this outcome or this side effect, and each of those has different costs attached to it. And you sum all that up over the long term, the lifetime usually of patients, and you compare one pathway to another. The costs that are looked at in a cost effectiveness model, I want to emphasize, are not just one kind of cost like drug costs. We are always comparing all healthcare costs. That means that if a drug is very expensive but helps prevent hospitalizations many years later, we capture that benefit. And in a sense, the drug gets credit for it in its cost effectiveness. The standard measures of the health outcomes we use in the model are really, they come from what happens to patients in the evidence that we have, frequently from clinical trials. So if the clinical trials have shown that one treatment, for instance, provides functional improvement over another or prevented negative outcomes, we use that and put it into the model. Every model tries to capture either directly or indirectly how many additional life years patients might get from a beneficial treatment. But life year, how long we live, is not the only thing, certainly, that patients care about. It's their quality of life. And we could all imagine that two drugs might both extend life by 3 years, but one has terrible side effects. That drug isn't as valuable. And we would say, ultimately, that it shouldn't receive the same value-based price. So we track quality of life, and we get there in ways that I'll talk about in a second. But we do sum these comparisons of quality of life and life years gained across treatments. And to do that, we, in a sense, need a common measuring stick. And so that stick is called a quality adjusted life year that combines length of life and quality of life. Now, ICER also uses something called the equal value of a life year gained. And again, I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. It's a complementary way to, if you will, combine the impact of treatment on the length of life and the quality of life. Let's talk about the QALY first. So this has been the core measure, if you will, of health economics and cost effectiveness for decades. It was created in the US by researchers here, and it's fully recommended by US and international bodies. It doesn't mean that it can be used without a lot of awareness of what its strengths and limitations are. Like any measuring stick, it can be misused. It is a measure used to compare two or more treatments, as I mentioned before, by comparing their impact on both length and quality of life. So where does this information come from? Well, the evidence on the differential impact between the two treatments, let's say, on length and quality of life, generally comes from clinical studies. It can come from real-world evidence or other sources, absolutely. But if we're trying to compare them together, it's often best if we get that comparison from a single study. Now, the clinical and the functional outcomes that go into the QALY as the measure of health gain, again, think of things like pain scores for a treatment for pain, or whether a treatment can help patients walk. If that's the outcome of a study, ultimately, if we're trying to compare treatments to make sure that we're doing kind of a fair approach to pricing across all treatments, we have to say, well, how do we translate that into quality of life if quality of life isn't measured directly? And this is actually one of the tricky parts, because sometimes we have to really ask ourselves, well, whose opinion do we use to say how much better it is to regain sight, let's say, or to get worse? I mean, whose opinion about how bad it is to lose the ability to hear do we use? I want to make a very specific reference here to concerns of patient groups who have sometimes felt that their view of how bad or good it is to live with their condition can be ignored. Here's the way it can work, though. It can be tricky, because let's say that patients who are blind, or people who are blind, may feel that they have accommodated very well to that situation, and in a society that, in a sense, socially accepts people who are blind and takes steps to make sure that they are fully independent and able to integrate into society, that being blind really is no worse, if you will, from a health perspective than being fully sighted. On the other hand, if you take people who are fully sighted and you say you have two options for treatments, one of which gives you a 50% chance of being blind at the end of therapy and the other one doesn't, I think most people would understand that from their perspective, they certainly would want to pay more and probably get the drug that has a no risk of having them end up blind. So we have to figure out a way to capture, in a sense, one perspective about how bad it would be to be blind if you're fully sighted today and you're taking two treatments, while certainly recognizing that being born without sight and being able to function in society, we are not saying that that's of lower value to be a person who doesn't have full sight. So we are trying to value the treatment's effect on people and really not valuing the people themselves or what their lives, whether their lives have value or should be viewed as commensurate in value to society. We're talking about side effects, things that can get better, and trying to make sure. So in a cost effectiveness model, we often try to get information on these views on quality of life from both people who are healthy and considering treatment and people who have the condition, and try to make sure that we understand both perspectives when we're talking about cost effectiveness. So that's the QALY. What about the equal value of a life year gained? This is kind of a modification of a way to think about the benefit of treatments that we have kind of coined, because we think, again, it's very important as a complementary view to the QALY. What it does is it takes all of the beneficial or kind of negative effects on quality of life of a treatment throughout a patient's lifetime and still captures that versus one treatment versus another, except if that treatment extends life. If it does, for the amount of time that the treatment extends life, let's say again that it extends life by 3 years over what treatment, over how long the average patient would have lived before, we take those 3 years, and no matter how sick the patient might be for those 3 years or well, those extended days, months, or years are treated as if they were in full health. All extended time is weighted as if in full health. So as it says here, 1 day of extra life is valued the same no matter at what quality of life. The reason we do this is because in some way we want to respond to a reasonable concern that if cost effectiveness were misused to separate patients into different groups and say, well, if you use this treatment among people who are disabled, we're not getting as much full quality of life, if you will, as if we were to use it in healthy people. Now, that's not what we or other health technology agencies do with cost effectiveness, but the concept is noxious enough to everyone that we think that by using the EV/LYG as a complementary measure, we can certainly eliminate any risk that treatments that do extend life at lower function will receive a lower value-based price benchmark. And that's a good thing. The only downside, and again, it's kind of hypothetical, but there is a downside that if you used only the equal value of a life year gain, it would override patients' own valuation of their experience that time spent at a much higher function is worth more than extended time at lower function. A quick example would be some patients with a very, very bad condition might say, I really would much rather spend 2 years fully cured than 10 years in my current condition. And so if I'm comparing 2 treatments and one just keeps me like this for 10 more years, the other one would give me 2 years fully cured, I would highly value the 2 year at a cure. Now again, we're not doing individual decision making. Some patients might feel differently, but if we're looking at it at the population level, the EV/LYG would actually give higher value to the drug that left you still quite disabled or at a lower function for many, many years than one that would cure you for 2. So that's the one downside. And so using them together we think is important in cost effectiveness, and is something that all our reports now contain, is equally highlighted findings of the cost per QALY and cost per equal value of a life year gained. Quite frequently those are the same. It's only when you're going to find a drug or a treatment that extends life at a very low function of life that these would diverge very much at all. So that's how we talk about both the costs and the health gains or losses that go into calculating a cost effectiveness number. But there's another piece of this that's linked to decision making around what a fair price is that I need to explain next, and that's value-based price benchmarks and cost effectiveness thresholds. So to do that, I think it's helpful to see a little graph, because this very simplistically shows essentially what ICER does when it comes up with what it says is a quote-unquote value-based price benchmark, or actually what ICER will be calling henceforth a health benefit price benchmark. So let's assume that that blue dot here in the middle reflects the best treatment we have today for congestive heart failure, and it has a certain effectiveness versus no treatment, and it has a certain cost. Now, effectiveness here is going to be measured in QALYs and equal value life year gain, so we can see both. But let's assume we have 2 new treatments. Here's the first new treatment. It's more effective. You can see it provides more QALYs and EV/LYGs, and it's more expensive. Now we have a second new treatment. As you can see, it's even more effective, slightly, but more effective, and at a much higher cost. So if you're a patient and you don't have to pay a penny for any of these, you probably want the most effective treatment. Ultimately, though, the question here is, at what price would that more effective treatment, the one on top there, be a reasonable value? And to do that, we have to apply something called a cost-effectiveness threshold. That's basically a statement of what price is it willing to pay, reasonable to pay for what additional health gain. So here you can see that if we had a certain price for the first treatment that was more effective at a higher cost, it has come in at a price lower than the threshold, and that's a good thing if you're talking about value. It means we are getting enough clinical gain for the extra price to be a reasonable or good value. The one on the top, however, is in a different situation starting out. Its price is too high to meet that threshold. And so a value-based price would be the price at which we would get that gain, but within the threshold. So as you can see, it's still a higher price than the first new treatment. That's because it is a more effective treatment, but that price is scaled in proportion, if you will, to how much better it is. Now, you may be thinking, how do we know what the scale is? How much more is fair to pay for a certain amount of health gain? And now I'm going to talk about how we set thresholds. So the cost per QALY thresholds is something that people have also debated, done research on, argued about for decades. But there are basically a couple of main ways to think about it. One is generally called willingness to pay. That just means how much should a society really be willing to pay for, and it's per QALY because that's just an easy way to kind of create a common measure again. So for an additional healthy year of life, what is society willing to pay? Now, some groups like the World Health Organization and the American College of Cardiology have said, well, it's somewhere in the range of 1 to 3 times a country's per capita GDP. So it's based on how wealthy a society is, and using per capita GDP is a way to be able to look at that. By the way, in the US, that would be about 50 to 150,000 per QALY. Now, research, interestingly, using individual surveys about how much individuals value health versus other things they could use their money for, etc., have actually more recently suggested a threshold around 100,000 per QALY, which, interestingly, is just smack dab in the middle of that broader range that other groups had earlier suggested. But there's a very different way to think about a fair threshold, and that is generally called the opportunity cost approach for the overall health system. What this means, and it's easier to calculate in some sense in health systems that have real budgets, but it means that if you have a true budget for healthcare and now you have to pay for something new that's coming in at a higher price, something's going to get kicked out of the healthcare basket, if you will. And by measuring what gets done and not done and the effects on health, researchers, for instance, in the United Kingdom, have shown that there the opportunity cost threshold is around $15,000. It's about 13,000 pounds per QALY, but 15,000 US dollars per QALY. They suggest it should be around 40,000 per US dollar in the US, but there's another researcher and way of thinking about it that links the opportunity cost more to the effect on loss of health insurance and the deleterious health effects of that. And that estimate, which probably doesn't capture delaying in care and other things that happen as healthcare costs go up, but that general approach has produced a number closer to around $84,000 per QALY as an opportunity cost threshold. And what that means is that if you are paying more than $84,000 per QALY for something new, you are getting health, but you are spending more for it than you should, and that means that you're actually going to lose more health through loss of insurance by someone you don't know. You know, the trick here is that the trouble, I should say, or the difficulty, is that you can see the patient that you're treating with the new treatment. You can see the health benefits that they're getting. You can't see the individual or the people who are hurt by rising increases in healthcare costs and the health that's lost on that end. So that's the kind of general meaning of an opportunity cost threshold. What do we do in our reports? Well, in a sense, we give everybody something to hang on to. We use range. We're not going to pick a single number. We, in all of our reports, provide results to say what a fair price would be if you wanted to meet $50,000 per QALY and equal value of a life year gained, $100,000 per QALY, $150,000 per QALY, and $200,000 per QALY. So in a sense, we kind of start lower and go higher than most of the academic work suggests. We do, however, for our own health benefit price benchmark, select the range from 100 to 150,000 per QALY, and we provide a separate health benefit price benchmark using the equal value of a life year gained, also 100 to 150,000 per QALY per EVLYG. So that range, and we'll talk a little bit more later again about how that range sometimes can be interpreted in context of other information, but it sends a signal that there is no one right answer. Decision makers should think about cost effectiveness as a piece of the decision, and that there are differing views on what one single threshold might be in the first place. We've generally tended to pick our range at the higher end of what the academic literature is suggesting, and you can see that continues today, where the academic information or theories and evidence would generally suggest 100,000 or even lower, 84,000, etc. for the thresholds in the US. Ours is higher, and that's partly because we view the use of our work as often setting ceiling prices, but it's not to suggest that 150,000 is the absolute perfect top number that should be used. It is generally, though, higher than the most recent evidence is suggesting. So let's go back to that overall framework, because now on the left-hand side, where I've been talking about long-term value for money, I've been doing comparative clinical effectiveness, now incremental cost effectiveness. I'm going to talk now about other benefits or disadvantages and contextual considerations. All right, this is one where you're definitely going to want to look at the documents themselves and not try to read every single word on this slide. But this is our list of potential other benefits or disadvantages and contextual considerations that are discussed in the report and are a prominent feature of our public meeting. They're not just there for discussion, however. They are there for votes themselves. And the way this is structured, you can see the column on the left says 1 suggests lower value. There's an intermediate column, if you will, and then 3 suggests higher value. Each of these potential other benefits or disadvantages and contextual considerations are framed in a way such that our independent appraisal committees can vote on them to send a very strong signal to decision makers around the other factors in value that should weigh into thinking, in addition to the comparative clinical effectiveness and the cost effectiveness. So let me just cover a few of these to show you the way it works. So the very first one is actually kind of a contextual issue about the evidence itself. On the left-hand side, it says uncertainty or overly favorable model assumptions create significant risk that base case, that means the kind of our primary finding, base case cost effectiveness estimates are too optimistic. Now, if most of the committee feels that way, that would certainly suggest that the value should be at the lower end, if anything, of what we've said of our health benefit price benchmark. On the other hand, look at number 3, where it suggests higher value. Here, uncertainty or overly unfavorable model assumptions create significant risk that the base case cost effectiveness estimates are too pessimistic. So again, that would certainly tilt you towards a sense that it has higher value than the ICER report has suggested, and that the value-based price benchmark should certainly be viewed within that kind of context. Other elements of this list, it's really apples and oranges, but some of them are meant to capture specific benefits that a treatment might provide that are not captured in the clinical evidence, the clinical trials. And so, for instance, some treatments will have a significant impact on improving patients' ability to return to work or their overall productivity versus a comparator. And that's rarely captured in clinical trials. And it sometimes can be very hard actually to get good estimates of this for cost effectiveness modeling. So we want to make sure that it is at least addressed as part of a potential other benefit, whether it does or doesn't have a significant impact on ability to return to work. Another one here is really something about choice. So on the left-hand side, it says the intervention offers no special advantages to patients by virtue of presenting an option to certain patients who have a notably different balance of timing of risks and benefits. Sorry, I think that needs to be reworded or rewritten. But the idea here is that there are, and on the right-hand side, it says it does offer special advantages. What we mean there is that some patients will benefit from having the choice of a treatment that might have the same overall effectiveness if you look at quality of life and length of life, but somehow the package is put together differently. So let's say there's a patient with cancer, and there might be one option that has a 20% chance of living 5 years. Another one might have a 30% chance of living 5 years, but you also have a 10% chance of dying in the first 6 months. So some patients are going to want to take that risk and go for the better chance of living 5 years, others won't. And it's having that choice that in a sense represents a certain potential benefit of a treatment entering practice if it gives that kind of really distinctly different set of risks and benefits, or the timing of the risks and benefits for patients and clinicians to think through. So what is really the intended role of all the votes? Those 1, 2, 3 votes will show the average scores for each one in the meeting. Each one will be reflected in the report. But conceptually, what we believe is that decision makers should certainly consider the full range of the health benefit price benchmark. If they're thinking about what a fair price might be, we want them to apply those potential other benefits or disadvantages and contextual considerations to their thinking, and it should push them, if you will, in one direction or the other. It could even push them beyond those boundaries, but that's up to the ultimate decision maker. But if we think that those boundaries are already, in a sense, kind of a ceiling, given the evidence, it might make sense for it to be viewed that the potential of the benefits and contextual issues help, in a way, distinguish within that range. So that's our general view, and it's something that we feel very strongly about because we know, again, that just the facts, as seen in the clinical trials, or even real-world evidence, just the clinical and cost effectiveness, the best we can do with cost effectiveness modeling, it's not everything that should be considered when talking about fair price, when talking about fair access, and certainly when talking about future innovation. So we need a process of fair deliberation that can bring these elements into view and into the policy making ultimately. So looking back again at this overall conceptual framework, I now need to turn to the short-term affordability side and talk briefly about our approach to potential budget impact analysis. Again, this involves our coming up with a potential budget impact threshold, and I'll talk about how we get there. But we're always going to have a way of trying to, in a sense, provide information on the potential budget impact, and then we use a threshold to send a signal to policymakers. What is that signal? It's meant to be a signal of when the amount of added healthcare costs that are associated with a new drug or test or different kind of system intervention, even if it has good long-term value, it may be that the short-term costs are going to be difficult for the health system to absorb without displacing other needed services or somehow leading to very rapid kind of escalation in healthcare insurance costs that clearly have damaging effects on both access and affordability. The kind of iconic example of this in the last decade were the new treatments for hepatitis C, which had excellent long-term cost effectiveness and value, excellent. But in the short term, there were over 3 million Americans infected with hepatitis C. And if all of them had shown up for treatment in the first day or week, the system would have been literally inundated, not just with patients, but with costs that it could not manage well. And as it played out, Medicaid programs, the VA, and even some private insurers really struggled in the short term to cover these costs. So it doesn't mean that it should be a budget cap and that we need to stop spending at a certain level or else. It just means that we need to think really carefully and in advance about how we can manage the introduction of one of these types of interventions. It may mean that we do need a lower price or one that's stretched out over time. It may mean that we need to redouble our efforts to identify and get rid of other waste in the healthcare system. It may mean we need a bailout from the legislature for 1 year to get us through. It just needs to be thought about, because if it's not planned for well, we will get access restrictions for patients one way or another, and or affordability crises. So that's what we don't want. We need to have a better system for dealing with these kinds of treatments at their cost. So I'm going to try to be somewhat brief because the details here are better covered in the documents. But we have basically a transparent approach to trying to calculate how much drug spending can continue to grow as a part of healthcare spending if healthcare spending is growing no faster than the United States GDP plus 1%. That basically means we don't want healthcare costs to grossly outstrip the growth in the overall economy. And so within that budget target, we say how much should new drugs, in a sense, ideally contribute to that growth. We guess, in a sense, based on recent data, how many new drugs are we likely to get over the coming year? And we say, well, if we slice up all of that new spending among each drug, we could spend this much. And in this, if you go to row 7, you'll say 409 million would be slicing up all the cost growth for drugs just among the new ones. And it would be 409 million. But because we want to basically send a signal of when to be worried, we don't want to ring the alarm too often. So rather than ringing the alarm if it goes over the average, we double that amount and say if it's going to be double that or more each year for the first 5 years of its introduction, over the first 5 years of its introduction, then we really should talk about how we're going to manage the access and the affordability, even if it's a good long-term value. So the way we do this in our reports is we really try to make it an interactive process for different decision makers who will have their own prices, their own estimates of how much the drug will be used and what % of the eligible population will use it, etc. So here in this graph on the left-hand side, you see the price of the treatment, and the lower horizontal axis is the % uptake among eligible patients at 5 years. And then you do see, in a sense, in the line, the black line, the potential budget impact threshold. If it's meant, in that case, I think it was $819 million. We recalculated every year. Well, let's assume it was $819 million each year over those 5 years. What this allows policymakers to do is to say, well, let's see, I think my price is going to be $70. If that's the case, then I can only treat maybe 6% of all eligible patients without going beyond that budget impact threshold. Now, again, we're not suggesting that people should not go past that budget impact threshold. They should just be aware that that is, in some sense, a signal that affordability and access may be an issue. This line also allows you to say, well, 70 might be my price, but what if I got 50%? Hey, I could treat 10% of the patients, or $30, I could treat up to 20%. So it allows different people to do what ifs, depending on how much their price is and how many patients they think their system or the whole country would be using. So I mentioned the idea of an alert or an alarm. So what we do in our meetings is we actually turn to clinical experts, and we've been talking to them all the way through. But at the meeting, we try to be transparent and ask, what ideally would be, from a clinical perspective, a purely clinical perspective, what % of patients who are eligible should get it? Sometimes it's 100%. Every person who's eligible should get it. But sometimes there are reasons why they don't think that that's really kind of even clinically ideal. So, but if we do get information from them, and let's just hypothetically say they said 25% of eligible patients over 5 years would be the right target, and we know that the price is going to be $50, then you can see that connects to a budget impact above the threshold. And so we put an affordability and access alert out. And all that means, again, is that hypothetically, if we want to treat 25% of patients and the price is $50, we are going to spend more over a 5-year period in the short term than would be consistent in some ways with keeping the overall cost of drugs and of healthcare within a target of growing not much faster than the national economy is growing. A lot of assumptions buried in that, but it's meant not to be a cap or a specific price that should be achieved. It's meant to stimulate the right kind of better policymaking so that patients don't get trapped in a vice of poor access and poor affordability, even for treatments that do have good long-term value. All right, now I need to turn briefly to talk about some of the modifications that we make for our methods in the value framework for specific kinds of treatments. First, I want to talk about treatments of ultra-rare disorders. Eligible for this are treatments for which there are approximately 10,000 or fewer individuals in the United States. That's a threshold that we developed after input from many, many stakeholders. And it's in some sense more generous than the threshold that European countries use. We also believe that it's important to limit any kind of modified approach to assessment to these kinds of treatments if there's no ongoing or planned clinical trials for patient populations that would be more than 10,000. So really ultra rare, that will stay ultra rare, not just one that's starting there with its first indication, but will rapidly grow to treat much larger groups. So in our reports, what we do is we provide specific context regarding the challenges of generating evidence for these kinds of treatments, because it really is hard often to conduct RCTs. There may just not be enough patients. They may be too spread out. It may be a condition for which, either through severity, but also its rarity, it's just not viewed as ethical to be able to randomize. So we want to make sure that decision makers understand that context. We also want to provide context around how it can be difficult to validate outcome measures for some conditions like this, and that it's very hard to obtain long-term data. This is true for almost any treatment, but especially sometimes for treatments for ultra-rare disorders. We also want to highlight that in that context, it's not unusual for the trials to evaluate treatments of ultra-rare to use historical controls. That's more common if it's a truly fatal disease. And again, with randomization not being viewed as ethical, it could be that the best way to look at its effectiveness is to use historical controls, because you can be very sure that if a patient survives with treatment, that would not have happened otherwise. And so it gives you a higher level of confidence. However, we do believe that our value-based price, here I should say again, health benefit-based price benchmark should remain 100 to 150,000 per QALY. At that level, and even with patient populations at 10,000 or fewer, unless you get to literally the single-digit number of patients, there should be enough revenue generated to support innovation and risk-taking and future investment. So our findings around health benefit price benchmark are still anchored to that 100 to 150,000 per QALY. However, we do include specific language that basically describes the history of decision makers around the world that have often gone higher than that threshold for very, very rare diseases. Also, part of our reports that's distinct here is that we invite manufacturers to supply information in any way they want that will not be edited by us and put into our report on the cost of research and development that would justify their price. So that if they believe that that's a strong element in their justification for a price, a fair price, then we are fully able and welcoming of that kind of information as part of the public debate. All right, the other kind of treatment for which we have slightly modified methods are what we call high-impact single or short-term therapies, or SSTs. Think of these as two types of eligible treatments. I actually jumped to the bottom of this slide. They really are kind of the one-time treatments that are maybe cures, or they could be short-term treatments that are either potentially cures or that offer transformative benefits, like completely halting the progression of a very serious disease like Lou Gehrig's disease or something like that. So with that kind of treatment, we felt like it was reasonable to consider modification, because these treatments, even if there's a lot of uncertainty around them, they are highly valued by patients, by society, in principle. We had one meeting where I asked a question: what's special, really special about these treatments? And one clinician raised his hand and said, we all feel we have to provide them. And that creates special responsibilities on us as clinicians, on manufacturers, and on insurers. And I think that was a pretty good answer. So they're highly valued, but we do have increased uncertainty. And that uncertainty comes with the possibility of there being truly unrecoverable costs. So we spend a huge amount for a one-time treatment, not really knowing for sure whether it's going to pan out and the cure is going to last. So that creates a special tension, if you will, about how we manage pricing, kind of evidence analysis and payment. And it also creates specific challenges, I think, to traditional cost-effectiveness modeling around the ways that uncertainty is managed and the way that pricing is done. So the modifications we had are laid out in a white paper on our website, but I'm just going to highlight basically 3 that are linked to what I think could be called additional modeling scenarios. And this just means we're providing more information for decision makers. One is that in addition to exploring uncertainty in the model as we usually would, we also are going to create very formal, optimistic, and conservative scenarios based on the benefit. That means we will take a conservative view of the duration, the magnitude, or the quality of the effect, and an optimistic kind of version of that. Because often, not always, but often what we think is most reasonable is somewhere in the middle, or somewhere towards one side or the other. But we think decision makers really will want to see an optimistic and a fully conservative kind of scenario as well. We're going to do what's called a threshold analysis, saying if we know the price at least, how long would it need to last for it to appear cost effective within our range? So it might need to last for 5 years or 10 years or 15. And again, that will give extra information for decision makers. And then for the special problem that arises around cures, let's say, of very expensive chronic conditions, we want to create something. We are going to do what we call hypothetical shared savings analyses. Hypothetical because we are not going to use them as our formal value, health benefit price benchmarks, but again, they'll provide additional views on a fair price for decision makers to consider. The first is to take 50% of the cost offsets, and instead of wrapping that into the value or health benefit price benchmark for the drug, leave it to the health system. I need to give a brief example. So the current care for many patients with hemophilia is very, very expensive. For some subpopulations, it can extend higher than $50 million over their lifetime. So let's assume we had a cure for that. Would we think that the cure was worth $50 million? Should it be? Well, traditional modeling would say yes, albeit with some of the discounting and other features of how health economics methods work. But we think it's important for people to at least debate whether maybe the manufacturer doesn't get all of those cost offsets kind of, again, wrapped back into the price of their drug. Maybe they leave half on the table for society and the health system. Another way to do that, or to provide another perspective on doing that, would be to say you can cost offset with a cure, but we're not going to let it be more than $150,000 per year. And that will help, again, moderate, if you will, the presumed fair price for a cure of a very expensive chronic treatment. Now, again, these are hypothetical, and they are intended to stimulate further discussion among all stakeholders around how we do want to value these special kinds of treatments that, as I mentioned at the very beginning, are highly valued in principle by society, but which trigger significant concerns about what their price and affordability will be. All right, lastly, I want to turn to our procedures, our processes for our meetings and the overall report generation. So again, too many words and too small a font, more detail available on our website. But to note that our overall report development process takes 8 months. And this includes multiple phases of getting input from the public and from patients. It starts, in a sense, even before this diagram does, with early contact to patients and manufacturers. But we have formal open public input followed by our scoping phase. We obviously create a draft report that's open for public comment and further feedback from all stakeholders. The evidence report is that which goes to the public meeting, and then the final report is the report that wraps in the deliberation at the meeting, the votes and the recommendations. Now we have something that we are starting in 2020, it's in a sense a formalization of many things we've already been doing, but we want to make sure that it's cohesive and easily visible to the patient community. It is our patient engagement program. So it includes annual calls and often in-person meetings with patient groups for major therapeutic classes. These are large conditions usually, or areas that overlap, where we can have an annual meeting to talk about the horizon, the pipeline, what evidence can be generated, and try to get way ahead of the curve to make sure that the best evidence and input is available for our reviews. We also do early outreach to other patient groups when we have high certainty that we are going to pick a topic that is their condition for a review. The overall goal is to make sure that we provide early guidance on our processes, especially for patient groups that have not worked with us before, and figure out if we can help facilitate in any way to empower their engagement. It might mean that we need to do some training with them around cost effectiveness, or it might mean, again, some way to think about making sure that they feel fully engaged and empowered as part of the process. Now, at the time of the topic announcement, we have already done this a little bit before, but we already want to start a very deep dive with patients and patient groups to find out what is most important for them, what matters, what's in the trials, what's not in the trials, how do we rank these things, how comprehensive do we need to be, and we want to start to figure out as early as possible if patient groups can contribute some way to the economic model by either generating new data or helping us find data that they've had and just hasn't been published yet, whatever it might be. Now, for key outcomes, though, without data, we are going to be working with patient groups on an increasingly regular basis to identify potential real-world evidence sources or to develop a new patient survey to try to get that baked into our review. Another important part of our patient engagement program that's going to start, we've been doing this one already, but we invite them for a formal debrief on the experience so that we can learn and hopefully from their experience. And we often find that we do, even though we've been talking regularly, we find out ways to do it better the next time. But something that is new starting in 2020 is that we're at the conclusion of every review, we are going to make a formal offer, if they wish, to co-produce and promote a letter to the FDA and other stakeholders with proposals for how to improve the generation of more patient-relevant data throughout the whole drug development process. We always find that the data could have been better. We often find ourselves speaking with one voice at the meetings, patients and we and others, about how this should be better. And we want to figure out if we can create a better megaphone to circle back to the FDA and other policymakers. And so we're hoping that through this offer that patients may view it as a good way to have that important piece of what comes out of our meetings get greater traction at the FDA and elsewhere. So our independent appraisal committees meet between 3 to 4 times per year in 3 different groups, one in California, one in the Midwest, and one in New England. And just a brief bit about the meeting process itself on the day. Well, first, I'll use CPAC as a general term, Comparative Effectiveness Public Advisory Council. In general, we call them appraisal committees. So they receive the evidence report following the public comment and revision of the draft evidence report. They have a call with clinical experts 1 week before the meeting to make sure they get all the kind of nuts and bolts ironed out about how the condition is treated, what its pathophysiology, the things that they should know before they head into a deliberation meeting. And then at the public meeting, the agenda basically starts with kind of a review of the evidence on effectiveness and cost effectiveness that's presented by the lead reviewer. Sometimes that's an internal ICER staffer, sometimes, often actually, it's an external academic that we have worked with. Second, patient representatives and clinical experts during that process are at the front table, available to comment and respond to questions from the CPAC. We then have a phase of the meeting dedicated to manufacturer comment and discussion, both with the ICER research staff and with the CPAC. Similarly, we have the same for patients and broader public comment after that. Then, in a sense, we reconvene and have discussion of everything that's been heard and voting on specific questions related to comparative clinical effectiveness, each other benefit or contextual consideration, as I mentioned, and they have a question about long-term value for money at the current pricing, in which they are asked if you will, to integrate all of those different pieces of long-term value for money in their heads and give guidance on whether they think that represents high value, intermediate value, or low value. The last part of each public meeting is a policy roundtable where we have discussion among patients, clinical experts, manufacturers, and payers, and we talk really kind of in depth around how the evidence should best be applied to things like pricing, to coverage, to kind of clinical guidelines, to how it's really going to get traction in the healthcare system, while also talking about future research needs. And this is what comes out in our final report. It has the full results, again, of the evidence assessment. It has the voting with commentary. We try to capture as best we can the key themes and recommendations arising out of the policy roundtable, and those are applied to the very important things to patients and others about how to do this better in clinical care, how to do insurance coverage so that we can get that fair access, certainly with fair pricing and future research. We are instituting in 2020 a more formalized approach to report updates whereby every report will receive a 12-month checkup. That means that we're going to reach out to all the stakeholders at 12 months after the initial posting of a final report to see if there's any new data that may really affect report conclusions, and we may ourselves update our systematic review if needed. We will decide at that point whether we think that the report is still current, can be viewed as still current, or whether it's no longer current, and decide what kind of process it needs for updating, a kind of a full soup to nuts update or something more targeted. We're also going to start a pilot in 2020 in which we are going to start formal 24-month updates using real-world evidence for treatments, drugs that are approved under accelerated approval pathways. This will require special collaboration with a partner to help us organize and analyze real-world evidence, but we think it's going to be important to learn from the process of giving accelerated approval a little bit more time, if you will, to generate the evidence that's expected to help patients, clinicians, and others make a more informed judgment of the long-term value for money. All right, so as we wrap up, I just wanted to come back again to the overall picture of the ICER value assessment framework. ICER has been using a framework, if you will, for how many years now? Well, informally, we had one certainly going back to the beginning more than 10 years ago, but we had our first really formalized version around 2016, 2017. So we're now certainly into at least the second iteration, and we feel that through experience, through lots of very valuable public comment, we have continued to refine it and hone it. There are some important changes being made at the launch of the 2020-2023 timeframe. But ultimately, its structure and its principles remain the same. Long-term perspective on value, inclusion of elements and evidence from all sources to send a signal that decision-making about value needs to consider the broader context. And also a restatement that this is all about the goal, that we really need to keep in mind that this is about moving the U.S. healthcare system towards one in which patients get what they deserve, which is a fair price, fair access, and a world of future innovation. From us at ICER, they and others also deserve fair deliberation. We hope to remain very true to our principles of respect for all, for providing clear and inclusive procedures, transparent decision-making, even if it's not spelled correctly, and a commitment to continue to learn and to listen. And with that, I want to thank all of you who have provided comments to us through this process and in earlier iterations, and know that we will be looking forward to your future contributions. Thank you.